The Detroit Lions and the Minnesota Vikings are set to play in one of the biggest and highest staked games in NFL history. A battle for the NFC North, a battle for the NFC's one seed, a battle for a bye in the playoffs and home field advantage will shape not only each team's season, but the NFL playoff as a whole. And today, we're going to take a look at this game, take a look at all of the statistics, both teams' recent run of form, every single possible metric we can to try and decide a winner for not only the NFC North, not only the NFC one seed, but potentially the NFC's representative in the Super Bowl. So, with that being said, let's take a look at week 18, the final game of the season, game 272, Lions versus Vikings. Now, these two teams are two of the best in football. Both of them have been fantastic. With 14-2 records apiece, the 14-2 Lions winning 13 of their last 14 games, with their only loss being a 3-point differential to Buffalo, will host the 14-2 Minnesota Vikings, a team that over their last 9 games have won 9 straight. Their only losses on the year come at home to the Detroit Lions and on the road against the Los Angeles Rams. Two teams that have been in the playoffs, and a combined 4 losses between these teams are 4 playoff teams. The Lions have lost to the NFC South champion Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the number 2 team in the AFC in Buffalo, while the Vikings have lost to the number 1 seeded Detroit Lions in the NFC and the NFC West championship Rams. That is it. The only 2 teams that these guys have lost to are playoff caliber football teams, and both of those losses and all of those losses have come at very, very minute margins. Neither of these two teams are frauds. It would be impossible to say that. The Detroit Lions have a lot of key victories this year, and they've played a lot of good football teams. They've played Green Bay twice and beaten them twice. They've played Minnesota in Minnesota and won that game. They went to Houston on primetime football, and they took a victory. And, of course, they opened their season on primetime versus the Los Angeles Rams and took the victory in overtime. While the Minnesota Vikings have played a slightly weaker third place schedule this season, they still have played a lot of tough teams. Of course, just like the Lions, they've beaten the Packers twice, once at home and once on the road. They beat the Houston Texans at home in week 3 of the NFL season and actually beat the San Francisco 49ers back in week 2 when San Francisco was healthy with Brandon Ayuk, Trent Williams, and all of their Super Bowl aspirations still intact. The 49ers fell to the Minnesota Vikings early this season. Both of these teams have key victories. Both of these teams have gone to playoff environments and won football games. Both of these teams have welcomed playoff contenders and won their matchups. Both of these teams have yet to really be blown out in a football game. And realistically, both of these teams could be 16-0 going into this football game. Taking a look at the offenses for both sides, the Detroit Lions have the slight advantage, but it's not by much. They rank as the second best passing attack in football, the 4th best passing touchdown team in football with 38 on the season. They rank as the 6th best rushing attack with yards, 3rd best rushing attack in touchdowns, and they are the NFL's number 1 scoring offense. They average 33.3 points per game, which puts them as the 11th best scoring offense of all time. With just 2 field goals this week versus Minnesota, they will officially pass the greatest show on turf for a top 10 scoring offense in the league's history. Minnesota, although not historically great like Detroit, is still really good. They rank 5th in the NFL in passing yards, 5th in the NFL in passing touchdowns, just 3 behind the Detroit Lions. But their weakness on offense comes from the rushing attack. They rank 19th in yards and just 29th in rushing touchdowns on the season. They have just a total of 9, but despite that, they rank 9th in the NFL in points per game with 26.4 points per game to their name. Their offense is more than capable of taking football games. Their offense is more than capable of dragging the team to a victory, and it's done so multiple times this year. Switching to the defensive side of the ball, the Minnesota Vikings have the slight advantage here, with Detroit ranking as the 31st passing attack as far as yards allowed. They aren't very good. With injuries to Aiden Hutchinson, Aleem McNeil, Marcus Davenport, the linebacking core, the secondary, they have allowed a lot of yards through the air and rank 31st in that category. But their saving grace is that they've allowed just the 4th fewest passing touchdowns allowed, with just 3 quarterbacks having multiple passing touchdowns against them. That being Caleb Williams on Thanksgiving, Caleb Williams in week 16, and Josh Allen against the Buffalo Bills. That's it. The only three quarterbacking performances to see a quarterback throw multiple touchdowns against the Lions secondary is Caleb Williams twice and Josh Allen a singular time. The Lions also rank third in the NFL in interceptions. However, they rank 24th in sacks. They don't get to the quarterback very often. Without Aiden Hutchinson, without Marcus Davenport, without Aleem McNeil, the Lions pass rush has suffered. Their run defense has suffered a little bit less as they rank third in rushing yards allowed and eighth in scoring defense, but they have allowed more rushing touchdowns than you would have liked as they rank somewhere in the lower half of the NFL. The Vikings defense statistically is quite similar. They rank 28th in passing yards allowed, but rank 15th in passing touchdowns allowed. So much like the Lions, they allow a lot of yards through the air, but unlike the Detroit Lions, they allow right around league average of passing touchdowns allowed. Much like the Detroit secondary, Minnesota prides themselves on takeaways, but they are a much better pass rush than the Detroit Lions. They get home way more than Detroit, ranking third in the NFL in sacks, ranking second in the NFL in rushing yards allowed, and fourth in the NFL in scoring defense. So taking a look at these two teams, they are statistically nearly identical. On the offensive side of things, the Detroit Lions have the clear advantage in the rushing attack and overall points per game. But on the defensive side of the ball, the Minnesota Vikings are a much better sacking defense. They are a much better pass rush, and they do have a better scoring defense than the Detroit Lions. Both of these teams are top 10 in almost every single statistical category that matters on both offense and defense. So in that perspective, it's really hard to take a look and say one team has the clear advantage over the other. The Lions score more points, but the Vikings allow less points. The Vikings have a poor pass defense, but so do the Detroit Lions. Both teams have chinks in their elite armor, and both teams have the susceptibility to being taken advantage of through the air for big chunk plays and potential points. When it comes to injuries, both teams are relatively healthy going into this game in terms of who is on the actual 53-man roster. The Minnesota Vikings have two players this week who have not practiced, that being Kamu Grugier-Hill and Patrick Jones II. For the Detroit Lions, they have three. Backup offensive lineman Christian Mahogany, the sixth-round pick who looks like a star in the making, but will take a backseat to Graham Glasgow for likely the remainder of this season. David Montgomery, the Lions' hammer-on offense, has been out since the Buffalo Bills game and will not return until likely the divisional round of the playoffs. And then Emmanuel Moseley, the Lions' depth and secondary of Emmanuel Moseley is being tested yet again, as Moseley has suffered an illness, potentially will play for the game, but has yet to practice this week as he has been home with a sickness. So both teams are pretty healthy coming into this game. Both teams are likely at full strength, and the Lions' biggest advantage when it comes to injuries is Alex Anzalone, is most likely returning. He's been full practice all week, as has Khalif Raymond. The Lions are returning two captains, two playmakers, and two of the best players at their positions in the league, which will only help them going forward. The Minnesota Vikings are relatively healthy across the board outside of Christian Darrisaw. The offense is almost entirely healthy, and the defense, to my knowledge, is not missing any significant starters or playmaking pieces. The stakes for this game could not be higher. Not only are these two teams fighting for an NFC North championship, not only are these two teams fighting for the number one seed in the NFC playoff race, not only are these two teams playing for a bye in the NFC playoffs, but they are also playing for home field advantage. There could not possibly be higher stakes for a Week 18 game. While everybody else, the Chiefs and the Bills and the Packers and all of these different teams, the Eagles, are all resting their starters, the Detroit Lions are playing for a chance to get a bye week in the NFC playoff. The loser of this game will go on the road, likely to either Tampa Bay or to Atlanta, whoever wins the NFC South, and they will play on the road. They will play on the road for the first round. They will likely play on the road for the second round. And they will likely be the away team for the NFC Championship. The winner gets a first-round bye, an automatic bid to the divisional round, and they will host the divisional round. They will host the NFC Championship if they make it so far, and they will have a significantly easier road to do so. Now, with that being said, I think if there is going to be a football team that goes on the road as a 5 seed and upsets not one, but two different teams at home, it'll be the Detroit Lions or the Minnesota Vikings. The Detroit Lions are undefeated undefeated on the road this year. They are a perfect 8-0, capping off their victory versus the 49ers just a weekend ago. And Minnesota is pretty darn close. They are 7-1 on the road. Their only loss coming on a controversial call to the LA Rams in what was 10 games ago at this point. They are very good on the road as well. They win on the road almost as much as the Detroit Lions. So if any team can do it, if any football team can get snubbed from the 1 seed, go to the 5 seed, go on the road to playoff caliber teams and win football games, it will be one of these two teams. So with that being said, this game is as close as can be. And if you don't believe me, the Lions and Vikings have played one of the closest games of the NFL this season. Taking a look at the results of this game, I think it comes down to some pretty simple football tactics, right? As much as we talked about the passing attack and the rushing defense and the touchdown scores and the stars of this game and all the different moving pieces, it basically comes down to what we said at the beginning of the season. The Vikings' number 1 seed, their playoff hopes, their aspirations for a playoff bye come down to Sam Darnold. This is going to be a high-scoring game. This is going to be a very tight contest, and turnovers will make the difference. The Lions are probably going to score 31 to 35 points. That seems to be what they do pretty routinely against everybody in the NFL, and in particular, what they do against Brian Flores. The question is going to be, can the Minnesota Vikings keep up? Can they take advantage of the injuries on the Detroit Lions side of the defense? Can Sam Darnold put up good numbers and keep the offense within rhythm and within every drive? And essentially, will Sam Darnold carry this team across the finish line? If he plays really well, if he makes his reads, if he makes every throw, if he doesn't turn the football over, the Minnesota Vikings are going to have a really good chance of winning this game. If Sam Darnold throws an interception, if Sam Darnold throws 2 interceptions or loses a fumble or 2, if they give the Detroit Lions extra possessions, it's really hard to beat Detroit. If they can keep up with Detroit, score every single drive, continue to put points on the board, they're going to have a chance at the end of the game to steal the 1 seed and be probably the greatest Cinderella story in NFL history. As we talked about, the first time these two teams met, it was one of the closest games of the NFL slate. As we know, the Minnesota Vikings took a 10-point lead early. They drove down the field immediately, scored a field goal. The Lions turned it over on downs after a fake punt, which led to an Aaron Jones score. The Lions dominated the second quarter, 21 unanswered points going into halftime. They came out, both teams drew in the third quarter with a touchdown apiece, and with Minnesota closing the gap late, Jake Bates was forced to kick a 50-plus yard game-winning attempt that went through the uprights. But the score is not even the most telling part of that game. That game was closer than even we would have thought looking at the scoreboard. Taking a look at some of the more advanced and deeper statistics, both teams in that game had a turnover. Both teams in that game were 4 of 10 on third down. Both of those teams had 8 penalties for 49 penalty yards. Both teams had 4 sacks. There was an 8-yard total differential, 2 yards passing and 6 rushing yards in the difference between these two teams. Both favored the Lions, but at the end of the day, there was a difference of 8 total yards in that game. 2 total points. The sacks were the same. The penalties were the same. Third down conversions were the same. The biggest factor in that game, the biggest difference in that game was the Lions' failed 4th down conversion as opposed to Minnesota being 0 for 0. That stole a possession. That gave Minnesota the lead. That put Minnesota in a position to win that football game. And like we just talked about, that essentially counts as a turnover. Minnesota won the turnover battle in Minnesota the last time around, and they forced Detroit to kick a game-winning field goal as time expired. If the Lions can flip it on their head, if the Lions win the turnover battle, I think they'll put the Vikings away before the final drive. Not by a lot, probably by 10 points, in Minnesota having the chance to make it a 1-score game late, but it's going to come down to who wins the turnover battle. These are two of the best, most consistent teams in football, 2 of the hottest teams, 2 of the most talented teams, 2 of the best coached teams. And if the number 1 seed wasn't enough, if playoff buys and home field advantage and, the NFC North crown wasn't enough, this game will potentially decide coach of the year. This game could potentially decide MVP if either Sam Darnold or Jared Goff has a really good game. There are awards, there are statistics, there are accolades, there are playoff seedings, there are history books that will be written about the outcome of this game. It is one of the highest staked football games that I can ever remember. And quite personally, it is too close to call. So that's where I ask you for help. Put down in the comments below what you think about this game. Who do you think will come out on top? What do you think the difference will be? And who do you think will take the number one seed? I'm curious to hear your guys' opinions, curious to hear what you guys think. But at the end of the day, one thing is very clear. The Lions and the Vikings are two of the best teams in football. I think they will meet again in the playoffs. And I think round 3 is going to be just as spectacular as rounds 1 and 2. So with that being said, that is all for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching. Again, leave your comments down below of your score predictions, who you think is going to win, and what you think the outcome will be. But with that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.